when the sun stopped shining. If you were at the Good Friday service last week, you heard Jess Winterwheel read a passage of Scripture taken from Luke 23, and she began with those words. And this translation that she used was so pointed that I actually wrote this down because it helped me visualize the gravity of the scene. See, in this scene, after Jesus was nailed to the cross, Luke said that darkness had swallowed up the land for hours. And I would imagine that this darkness which consumed the scene also consumed the hearts and minds of Thomas and the rest of the disciples who stood watching their worst nightmare unfold before them. This was something that they had come to fear for Jesus since his ministry began. And so as Jesus slipped in and out of consciousness, as he bled from his brow and as he struggled to breathe, I can't help but imagine that the disciples and followers who were present, men and women who had given up their lives to follow Jesus, who had come to love Jesus and call him friend, looked upon this horrific event and probably felt completely helpless. They knew that Jesus had talked about going somewhere that they wouldn't be able to follow him, but how could they have known that he meant this? They watched as the sun refused to light the noon sky. They watched as soldiers scoffed at Jesus' near-naked body hanging from wooden planks. They watched as these soldiers cast lots for Jesus' belongings as if he were already dead and would never be able to claim them. They heard as the thief next to Jesus rebuked the other one, shouting, "We are getting what we deserve for what we've done, but this man has done nothing wrong." And they heard as the centurion declared, just a little bit too late, "Surely this man was innocent." Can you imagine being part of a scene like this? Can you imagine watching someone you love, someone you respect, and someone that you've given everything up for go through this? If you were at the Good Friday service last week, you watched as one by one candles in our sanctuary went out, leaving us sitting in increasing darkness as we reminisced over the crucifixion story. And you watched as Trey got up and extinguished the candle, the final candle, in front of the cross, and with impeccable theatrical timing, grabbed the cross, slammed it down onto the altar, and stormed out of the room in darkness. As I prepared for this sermon, and as I tried to put myself in the place of Thomas and the other disciples, it was difficult for me to truly begin to comprehend the kind of grief that they must have felt. The kind of grief that would cause them to walk away beating their chests. That was until that moment on Good Friday. Because in the moments that followed, I couldn't bring myself to get up out of my pew. Because as I sat there in darkness, something in my spirit was shouting, "No, it can't end this way." See, I knew that we weren't physically leaving Jesus behind, and I knew that we would be celebrating the resurrection in just 2 days. So I couldn't quite put my finger on why it was so difficult for me to leave the sanctuary in darkness with the noise of a crashing cross reverberating in my mind. The only thing that I could figure was that perhaps I was getting a tiny glimpse into what the disciples must have felt, what Thomas must have felt when he walked away from the cross in the darkness of that day. And so it's with this in mind that when we hear the story of doubting Thomas that Wes just read, I can't help but feel like Tom kind of gets a bad rap. See, Tom's just gone through something really rough and really personal. He watched on experience felt painfully fresh. This scripture passage seems to indicate that in the days which preceded Jesus' death, Tom wasn't around. He isn't with the other disciples when Jesus shows them that on the night of when Jesus shows them himself on the night of his resurrection. And while our text doesn't really give any indication as to where Tom might be when all of the other disciples were huddled up in a room somewhere trying to figure out their next move, I wonder if Tom was alone somewhere grieving. So can we really blame Tom for responding to the disciples' proclamation of seeing Jesus by saying that he was going to need some hard evidence? Unlike us, Thomas didn't exactly know that Easter was just around the corner. And perhaps what he'd been through was just too real and too raw, that in the moment that the news of the resurrection encountered him, it was hard for him to believe that resurrection was possible, at least without some kind of proof. We've come to this text having just celebrated Easter, a time in which we come together and rejoice in the occurrence of the resurrection and celebrate the newness of life which has been given to us. But we also come remembering, maybe all too well, the painfully dark season of Lent that we've just come through. If your Lent were anything like mine, there was probably a lot more sinking than swimming going on. And perhaps this season of Lent illuminated some tough stuff in our lives that make it difficult for us to truly live in a spirit of resurrection. Stuff that we're carrying around with us and struggling with that have yet to sort of experience that newness of life, even though 1 week ago that's exactly what we were proclaiming. Perhaps we find bits and pieces of ourselves today stuck in Lent and a little raw. And maybe in light of all this, we find ourselves feeling a little bit like Thomas, having difficulty believing that the resurrection happened, at least without a little bit of proof. I think sometimes we have hefty expectations when we come to the end of one season in our life and begin a new one, especially when the season was particularly difficult or when we have something that we're looking anxiously toward. We're so ready for our current season to be over that the idea of being stuck in it for longer than we anticipated is frustrating and sometimes downright disappointing. Let's take springtime in New Jersey, for example. After about 4.5 painfully long months of winter, which in my opinion is really pushing it because, let's say, I don't know, in Buffalo, it's like 7 months of winter. Just put this into perspective. But after about 4 months of winter, March 20th looks pretty darn good. But watch what happens here in New Jersey when it snows or hits 40 degrees or lower after March 20th. Oh, heck no. Facebook blows up. New Jersey news anchors are bitter at the weather people saying things like, yeah, I'll believe it when I see it, Jerry. I mean, people are angry. People are angry. They post pictures on Facebook and all over social media of a groundhog with devil horns and a subcaption that reads, "The groundhog is alive." People are mad. Now, don't get me wrong. People in Buffalo are like that too. I think it's just we have a bigger threshold for that kind of thing. But the point is, we act as if March 20th is some kind of big hoax. We forget that we've been through this process before. Even though we've seen it happen year after year, we act as if spring won't eventually come. In John 20, we find a grieving Thomas, a man so wrought with disappointment because of what he'd experienced days earlier, that on the night of Jesus' resurrection, not only did he miss an opportunity to witness it for himself because he wasn't there, but he missed an opportunity to believe when the disciples told him that they'd seen Jesus. For 7 days, he received this news. For 7 days after he received this Jesus. He needed to see Jesus, to touch Jesus, to experience Jesus in order to believe that the resurrection was possible. And on some level, we can definitely sympathize with Tom, right? I mean, he had been through a lot. We can understand why he wouldn't believe. But it's not as if Tom hadn't experienced big things before. The concept of resurrection wasn't exactly foreign to him. After all, in John 11, when Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, Tom was there. He was the one that led the royal charge back to Bethany with Jesus, saying that if Jesus really wanted to go back there and maybe meet his own death, he said, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." And when they got to Bethany, he was there. He was there when Jesus said to Martha, "I am the resurrection and the life now. Those who believe it, even though they die, will live." And if that wasn't blatant enough, 3 times in the book of Matthew, he foretells his death and resurrection to all 12 of his disciples. He said that on the 3rd day, he will be raised again. 3 times. I think we can understand how Thomas wouldn't believe, but perhaps we should consider why he should have. See, Thomas theoretically knew that the resurrection was coming. But things got personal. Life got hard. And Thomas couldn't remember what he experienced before. He couldn't remember the time that he spent with Jesus. Thomas missed an opportunity to believe in the reality of the resurrection that Jesus promised him because he was too busy grieving. He had to see it to believe it. So after what I can only imagine were 7 painfully long days for Thomas, Jesus came to him in that upper room somewhere. And in that room, Jesus gave him the very thing that he needed, the very thing that Jesus had promised him all along. Resurrection. He said, "Put your finger here, Thomas, and see my hands. Reach out and put your hand in my side. Do not doubt, but believe." And in the moment that Tom exclaimed, "My Lord and my God," Jesus had resurrected Tom's faith, and it was made brand new. An esteemed colleague of mine in one of my classes this week said that a God of resurrection does not just resurrect our physical bodies, but our minds, our perspectives, and our faith. And in Thomas's case, the God of resurrection absolutely delivered. Jesus said, "All right, Thomas, remember me? Remember how I'm Jesus, who knows exactly what you're thinking before you say it, before I hear it come out of your mouth? Remember how I said that I was going to come back? Well, here I am. Put your hand in my side. Jam your whole fist down in there if you need to. I love you so much that I'm going to give you exactly what you are asking for." But that's not all that Jesus says, because in the verses which follow, Jesus kind of calls Thomas out. He says, "If you believe because you have seen me, blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe." See, in these verses, he's calling Thomas to a higher faith. He's saying, it's great that you finally get what I've been saying all along, but there are people who will never have the chance to see what you have seen, Thomas. And when they believe in me, they are blessed. That is real faith. And friends, I can't help but think that Jesus could be talking about us. As we've come out of Lent and have lived through the first week of the Easter season, I wonder where we, like Thomas, are perhaps stuck in a spirit of Lent, expecting to see proof of new life in order to believe in the power of the resurrection. Perhaps it's difficult for us to come to terms with the reality of the resurrection because things in Lent got hard. It got personal. And maybe we're still carrying some of that around with us, wondering if Jesus really brings new life, and if the resurrection really happened, then where is it? Why don't I see it? Maybe we wonder this in regards to the exciting job prospect that we've been waiting for, or the one that fell through. Maybe it's the crappy attitude that creeps up on us even though we've just dedicated the entire month of March to praying it away. Maybe it's disappointing family relationships, sick children, friends that have been diagnosed with diseases, or death. When life gets personal, when it gets hard, it's hard for us to believe. It's hard for us to remember the reasons why we came to faith to begin with. It's hard to remember the times that Christ has moved in our lives before in the ways that we needed. And it's hard to remember that Christ is consistent in his promises to us. In the same way that Jesus was consistent in his promise of the resurrection to Thomas, we are given that same promise. And though we will likely never be able to experience the kind of proof that Thomas did of the resurrection, we are promised that when we believe without that proof, that we are blessed. Sometimes Jesus reveals himself in the ways that we need, like he did for Thomas. And then there are times that he reveals himself in ways and in a time frame that we don't expect, prefer, or understand. Perhaps, like Thomas, we find ourselves in circumstances in which we have every reason not to believe. But it is in those times that God calls us to remember. To remember the resurrection, to remember that it happened, to remember the work that Christ began in our lives on the day that he rose again from the dead, and that he continues to work in our lives today. To remember it, even if we have every reason not to. We are called to live in the resurrection because we are resurrected people. We don't live in the spirit of Lent anymore because the Lord has risen. And in the same way that Jesus renewed the call to the disciples to proclaim this resurrection when he said, as the Father has sent me, so I send you, he's calling us to do the same today. To proclaim and to witness to the reality of the resurrection in the things that we say and in the things that we do, even when we don't understand it, see it, or feel it. We are a blessed people because we are given an opportunity to believe and experience faith in the ways that Thomas couldn't. During Lent, I decided to give up my last half an hour of sleep every morning, well, most mornings, to get up and spend some time in prayer. And for those of you who even have sort of a basic knowledge of me, you know how much fun I probably thought that was. But one morning, I woke up and I opened our blinds to our apartment to find dimly lit rays of sunshine that glistened up through the trees outside of our apartment. It's not something you find very often in New Jersey in March, and so I decided to go and sort of pray out on the porch. And as I sat on the porch, I sort of looked around and I took notice that though the trees were mostly barren and the landscape was kind of brown, and the cesspool behind CRW Building 501 was still mostly frozen, the sun felt warm. There were little birds that sort of fluttered around in empty tree branches, geese that moved from one dead shrub to another, deer that sort of trudged around in the woods outside of our apartment. And it's like we were all sort of standing there waiting for something that was bubbling up from underneath the surface of the earth, waiting for the sun to regain its strength so that the trees would bud and the ice would thaw and the flowers would bloom. Springtime was coming. We'd experienced it before, and we could all feel it. But it wasn't there yet, and in fact, the very next day it snowed. And so it would have been really easy for me as I watched the snow on the morning before. It would have been easy to miss the opportunity to witness the early stages of new life begin to arise all around me if I focused my attention on the cold and barren remnants of winter. It would be easy for us as a church to forget the signs of new life that we experienced last week when we celebrated Easter and watched members in our community proclaim their faith and receive their baptism. It would be easy for us to forget because we all sort of carry around these dead Lenten pieces inside of us that are waiting for renewal. And it's easy to focus our attention on the remnants of seasons gone by, on those things that belong to Lent, but that we carry around with us in this Easter season as we wait for proof of new life. But when we make this our attention, we often miss the opportunities to see the new life that is budding all around us. We miss little opportunities to believe as we await the promise of spring, of new life, and of resurrection. And we miss the opportunities to be encouraged as we see that promise being fulfilled. Let us not miss the opportunity to believe in the promise of new life simply because death happened and because maybe it has lasted a little bit longer than we would like. Resurrection has come and is coming. The sun has risen and is rising. And the opportunity to believe it